Welcome to McNeil Tech, the wash experience. My name is Scott Ferry and I work for Budco, a distributor of McNeil wash systems. Today we're going to demonstrate how to replace the arm bearings on a wheel boss. Now this is the same procedures if the arm bearings are replaced on a gloss boss as well. When working on any equipment, understand all the hazards associated with the task. Before starting any work, lock out and tag out the equipment. Take all necessary safety precautions, including personal protective gear, which includes but is not limited to safety glasses, gloves, and footwear. Before we actually change the bearings, the first thing we want to talk about is why the bearings fail. Many times they fail prematurely because of the timing of the car wash. Now, this lead-on guide rail protector is there to protect the vehicle and the equipment if a vehicle is out of position. But the tire, if the car wash is set up right, the tires really shouldn't be impacting this surface at all. What should happen is the timing should be set so that the larger vehicles have this bumper right here, this protector right here, should be coming in on the wheel and the tire. Of course, with smaller vehicles, you have a smaller tire, so if it's coming in with the longer travel distance and it's a little bit into the brush area, that's totally fine. But what happens is if this is out of timing and this is coming in, especially on bigger vehicles with knobby tires, then we have the potential for the vehicle to ride up or to put a lot of stress weighing down on the front end of the brush. And when that happens, that causes the arm bearings to fail. So again, the timing is the critical thing to watch for to prevent premature failures on the bearings. This is a close-up of the two different bearings that are used on the arms. You'll notice that they're different sizes. So when ordering the parts, make sure that if you're doing a full replacement, you'll need 4 of one size of the bearing and 4 of the other side for one side of the brush. Now, the other thing to also mention is that also requires different sizes of hardware. So the smaller bearing is just your typical 3/8/16 hardware, but the larger bearing requires 7/16 hardware. And this isn't a common size to find at your typical hardware store. So it would be a good suggestion to make sure that you have extra hardware on hand just in case you drop something in the pit while performing the repair. In order to do this bearing replacement, we need to block the brush up. This is a lot of weight that's hanging out here in space, and so we need to support it so that it makes it easier for us to align the bearings and replace them. So the thing you do is you just rummage through your trailer or your truck and find enough material to block this up. Now the one thing you'll notice is on my pry bar, I've gone through here and put some electrical tape around there to protect that. Because remember, as we pry up, we don't want to damage the Pro-Coat surface on the framework. So just kind of pry it up, stick it under there. Now we're not doing a lot of prying. This is just to support it, so you shouldn't be lifting the brush much to do it. So now to remove the bearings, we put a block under here just in case there's some weight or the bearings have released on the other side so the arm doesn't crash to the ground. But we're going to actually remove the screws from the bearing and swing the arm out of the way. Now the one complication you may find here is there are set screws that hold the bearing on the shaft. And depending on how they were installed or assembled at the factory, those set screws may be inaccessible unless you move the arm out of the way. So we're going to remove these screws and remove that hardware, and then we can just take this arm and swing it out of the way. Now this is one of the other reasons why you don't want to lift a lot up on the front end when you're blocking it, just so that that doesn't have a lot of tension back on the arm where the bearings go in. So then we can take a Allen wrench and put it in here, find our set screws. We can remove that bearing. And we can do the same to the bottom. Now when this was assembled, there was anti-seize applied to the shaft, which made the removal of the bearing fairly easy. But we'll go ahead and remove the bottom one, and we'll be ready to put our new bearings in. We have the new bearing installed and in place on the bottom side here. But the one thing to mention before we put the top bearing on is the bottom bearing can be a little bit tricky because there may not be enough clearance between the bottom of the shaft and the framework of the equipment to remove this bearing. If that's the case, then you need to make a mark on your framework right here and then loosen the clamp back here and use this leveling screw to bring the arm up, or the frame up, enough to be able to pull that bearing off and replace it. So to put the top bearing on, the first thing we want to mention is there's a running change in parts replacement. And you'll notice that this bearing is the replacement for the brush side of the arm, but they now have two ports screwed in the bearing. One will have a plastic cap and the other will have a Zerk. Now, depending on the orientation of the bearing and which side of the brush it's on, you may need to switch the Zerk and the cap for proper installation. To replace the bearing, there is an orientation that's important to note. The portion of the bearing that carries the set screws should be towards the frame. So on the bottom of the arm, the orientation would be like this, and then on the top of the arm, the orientation would be opposite. So to install the bearing, we first need to apply a thin film of anti-seize to the shaft here. So we're going to do that. So with the anti-seize applied, we can go ahead and put the bearing on. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to line up those set screws so that I can access them without having to remove the arm for a future bearing replacement. So they're in place there. Now I'll go ahead and tighten those set screws. Okay, with the bearing secured with the set screws, we can now put the arm back in position. Now while we've been doing this work, the arm is kind of sagged a little bit in the bearings on the brush side, so we're going to need to pry this back into position to get those screws started. But the one first of all to mention, the screws, I've already gone ahead and applied a thin film of anti-seize on these bolts as well, and I've also gone ahead and protected the pry bar with some electrical tape. So I can just, it doesn't take a lot of effort here, but we're just going to pry that up to where we can get the screw started. There we go. And we'll go ahead and go through and secure all of these screws before we move to the brush section of the bearing replacement. The bearings are now secure on the arm and everything is back in position. So this is important to do. You do not want to try to tackle more than a pair of bearings at a time, just because the weight of the brush and the weight of the arm may make it difficult to line things back up. So with things back in position here, we can move on and demonstrate what to do on the brush side bearings. So replacing the bearings on the brush side, whether it be a Gloss Boss or a Wheel Boss, is essentially the same as the rear bearings. However, there is a few things that you need to do to make this possible. Now, first of all, we need to block the back end of the brush, just because we don't want to have it tipping or going out of alignment while we're replacing the bearings. Now, second, we're going to turn off the air. And the reason we turn off the air is we don't want anything pushing or retracting the brush off of our blocks when we do this. And to ensure that we don't have air, we can go ahead and disconnect the air line for the retract. Then we'll move the bumper back. So if you remember, the first part of the video we showed that we moved this arm out of the way in order to access the bearings. But when this is on the stop, then we won't be able to move that bearing back unless the arm back unless we move the stop itself. And then we can go on and actually replace these bearings, which like I mentioned, it's essentially the same as the other side. By moving the stop, you can swing the arm out enough to give you access to the set screws. One final thing to point out on the brush side bearing replacement is that the bearings on the arms themselves are oriented different, exit side to entrance side. So on the exit side arm, the bearings are on the same side of the arm itself. But as you move to the entrance side arm has the bearings that are on the post side of the framework on the opposite side of the arm compared to the brush side. Now what that means is that as the brush engages the vehicle, it will not maintain a true parallelogram. So on the back side, you'll notice that there is a slot instead of a hole cut for the bolts to secure the bearing to the arm. You can adjust the position of the bearing in that slot so that the brush itself will be parallel to the car when it is washing the car. If this is a new bearing or new installation, you can adjust it as you install it, but if this has been previously adjusted, you'll want to mark the position of the screws on the framework so you get it back in the same position. If it was not installed, then you can make that adjustment as you replace the bearings. Once the work is complete and the conditions deemed safe, the lockout tagout can be removed. Anytime you replace bearings on any equipment, it's always a good idea to grease the bearing before making the equipment operational. And then, as always, make sure you test, rotate the brush, move it in and out, and make sure that everything looks like it's in proper operating condition. Thank you for joining us at McNeil Tech, The Wash Experience.